Hi, thanks for joining me. For those of you new to this channel, my name is Mindy Mandell, and this channel, as you can see, is called All About Platonism. I put out a video about once a week, and in each video I talk about one of Plato's dialogues. My goal in these videos is to show the continuity of thought that runs through all of Plato's dialogues. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, I do hope that you will subscribe. Okay, well, today I'm going to be talking about the dialogue Philebus. And so the first question that we have about this dialogue is, why is it called Philebus? Here's the opening line of the dialogue. And by the way, all of the translations that I'm using today are by Thomas Taylor. So it opens with Socrates saying, "Consider now, Protarchus, what the doctrine of Philebus is, which you are taking upon yourself to second and support." So what we're seeing here is that the main interlocutor in this dialogue is actually not Philebus, but a man named Protarchus. However, Socrates is talking about the doctrine of Philebus, and so that's why I think it is called the Philebus. Okay, so now we have answered one question, but this raises another one. What is the doctrine of Philebus? Philebus then says that the good of all animals is joy and pleasure and delight in whatever else is congenial to them, and harmonizes with all other things of the same kind. This is then contrasted with Socrates' idea. What I contend for is that those things are not the best, but that to be wise and to understand and to remember, and whatever is of kin to them, things like right opinion or true reasonings, all of these things are better things than pleasure, and more desirable to all beings universally, that is, to such as are capable of receiving the participation of them, and that to all beings which have this capacity, the actual partakings of them is of all things the most advantageous, not only to those beings which are, but to those also which are to come. By the way, just a note here about this change here. The word eligible perhaps used to mean desirable, because that's the way it's used in this dialogue, but because it has changed its meaning since then, I put desirable here in brackets, and in future slides I just replace the word eligible with desirable because it has changed meaning, and so it's just confusing to have that word there. Okay, but we see here that Philebus's idea is that the life of pleasure is the best. Socrates says no, the life of understanding or intellect is the best. So now that we have their two positions, here is the goal of the dialogue, that we should each of us endeavor to set forth what state and what affection of the soul is able, according to our different hypotheses, to procure for every man a happy life. In other words, they're going to put these two lives side by side and decide which one is best. Now, it's also possible, of course, that there is a third option, which is actually better than both of them. What if there should appear some other, preferable to both of these, but more nearly akin to pleasure? Should we not in this case be both of us confuted and obliged to yield the preference to a life which gives the stable possession of those things wherein you place human happiness? However, at the same time, it must be agreed that a life of pleasure would be found more desirable than a life of knowledge or intellection, without a doubt. In other words, if there's a third option that's better, they'll go with that. And then for second place, maybe it will be pleasure if that's closest to the lifestyle that's first. However, we're going to also see here that if the life of intellect or knowledge is closer, then that will take second prize. But if that better state of the soul should appear to be more nearly allied to knowledge, in that case knowledge would be found to have the advantage over pleasure, and pleasure must give place. Do you not agree with me that these things are so, or how otherwise say ye that they are? To me, I must confess, they seem to be as you represent them. Okay, so now what we're going to find is that in this discussion of these two lifestyles, the life of pleasure, the life of knowledge, they're going to be able to touch on a number of metaphysical issues. So this is largely a metaphysical discussion here. This dialogue is mainly a metaphysical dialogue. And the first thing they're going to touch on are the problems of participation. How do things of this world participate in the intelligible things in themselves? This has come up in other dialogues as well, and it's dealt with in different ways in different dialogues. Let's take a look at how it's dealt with here in the dialogue Philebus. So what is Socrates talking about here? I mean, young man, when a thing is proposed to be considered, which is one, but is not of the number or nature of things generated and perishable. Pause for a moment. So what he's talking about here are the intelligibles, not things in our physical world. The ones which I mean are such as man, ox, beauty, good, when these henads, and I'll come back to that word, or such as these are proposed for subjects of debate, much serious attention is given them, and when they come to be divided, any one of them into many, much doubt and controversy arises. Okay, let me pause there for a moment and look at the word henads. Now notice that it's in italics, and that's because it's actually a Greek word that has been transliterated or put into our alphabet. The word henad in Greek means oneness, and so these are like the things in themselves. Also, sometimes you will see the word monad, and we're going to see that actually in the next slide, so I just want to say a quick word about it, that sometimes these words are used kind of interchangeably. When there is a distinction made, the henads rank higher. The monads are the things in themselves in the intelligible world, the beings, whereas henads, when it's used differently than the word monad, it's used to describe the gods as beyond being. Okay, that said, here we're looking at things in themselves, not things in our physical world. And Socrates says that much attention is given to them, and when they come to be divided, any one of them into many, when we're talking about the question of participation, much doubt and controversy arises. Protarchus wants to know upon what points. And we're going to see that there are 3 mentioned here. In the first place, whether such monads, he switched, and it's kind of an ambiguous word, and it's intentionally ambiguous because he wants to know, should they be deemed to have true being? So the question of, are they within the realm of being, or are they beyond the realm of being? And in the next place, how is it that these monads, every one of them being always the same and never generated, nor ever to be destroyed, have, notwithstanding, one and the same stability common to them all? And then lastly, whether we should suppose every such monad to be dispersed and spread abroad amongst an infinity of things generated and produced, in other words, immanent, and thus from being one to become many, or whether we should suppose it to remain entire, itself by itself, separate and apart from that multitude, in other words, transcendent. But of all suppositions, this might appear the most impossible, that one and the same things should be in a single one and in many at the same time. Can they be both immanent and transcendent at the same time? So those are the sorts of questions being raised here. Again, this is dealt with in different ways. We saw this dealt with in the dialogue Parmenides, and I will link a video here on that. And I did a whole video really about participation, so I will link that for you. But the way it's dealt with here is quite different. What Socrates wants to do here is introduce 2 other metaphysical terms, often called bound and infinity. Other translators might call them limit and unlimited. Socrates says that a gift of the gods to men, as it appears to me, by a certain Prometheus hurled from the gods along with a fire the most luminous. From the men of ancient times, men better than we are, indwelling nigher to the gods, this tradition of it hath descended to us, that those beings said to be forever derive their essence from one and many, and therefore have in themselves bound and infinity connatural to them. So essence is derived, it says, from bound and infinity, as the immediate causes of what he called here essence. Now this has been written about, the bound in infinity, have been covered by many of the later Platonists, such as Proclus, for example, and I'm going to give you a quote from Proclus. This was also translated, by the way, by Thomas Taylor. This is in his in Proclus's Theology of Plato. He says, that there is a certain one that is prior to being. It was called essence in the last one there. A certain one prior to being, which gives subsistence to being and is primarily the cause of it. Since that which is prior to it, prior to this certain one, and is beyond union to it is, that, let me start over again, sorry. There's a certain one prior to being which gives subsistence to being and is primarily the cause of it. And this is because that which is prior to it is beyond union, and it is a cause without habitude with respect to all things, and imparticipable, being exempt from all things. Let me stop for a moment and explain that. So whatever is the cause of this certain one, whatever is even beyond that, is a cause without habitude with respect to all things. In other words, even though we call it a cause, to use cause and effect is a certain relationship. They have a place to one another. And this cause that hasn't been named is so far beyond even this immediate primarily being a cause and effect, having that relationship. It's so far beyond that we don't even say that about it. It's imparticipable, meaning that things do not directly participate in it. It's so far transcendent. It's exempt from all things, another way of saying transcendent. If, however, this one is the cause of being and constitutes it, then there will be a power in it, generative of being. Okay, let's go back to this little chart here. Now here the word being was used instead of essence, so I'm going to add that. This is also the intelligible. When we're using the word intelligible in the plural, we're talking about intelligible realities or beings, plural, things like beauty and justice and greatness, and we saw others as well. When it is one as a monad, then it's just the intelligible or being or essence. And we're seeing here that bound and infinity were mentioned there by Proclus in this way, that bound is that certain one that is primarily the cause of being, and infinity then is its infinite power. And then what Socrates is going to go on to show us is that by putting together bound and infinity, by creating existence, you're also creating number. And let me explain that a little bit more. Being in the midst of things so constituted as they are, we ought to suppose and to search for some one idea in everything around us. For that, since it is there, we shall, on searching, be sure to find it. That after we have found it, we are next to look for two, if two only are next, otherwise three, or some other number. Again, that every one of this number we are to examine in like manner, until at length the man not only perceives that the one with which he began is one and many and infinite, but discovers also how many it contains. For that a man never should proceed to the idea of infinite and apply it immediately to any number before he has fully discovered all the definite number which lies between the infinite and the one, but that, having completed this discovery, we should then finish our search, and dismissing into infinity every one of all those numbers, we should bid farewell to them. The gods, as I before said, have given us to consider things in this way, and in this way to learn them and teach them one to another. Okay, a very confusing paragraph at first here, but let's go back to our little drawing here. What we're really talking about here is a difference between Platonism and some other spiritual systems. There are other systems where people like to talk in a more magical way or mystical way, keep things in a kind of mysterious way, as if that mysteriousness creates a profundity, or we can't understand the divine, and we shouldn't question it too much, and we don't want to seek understanding. People who want understanding are trying to pull the divine down to earth, and we should let it be mysterious. Platonism is quite different. We believe that by looking into this deeper understanding, by doing dialectic and by trying to better understand divine realities, we are getting a more profound understanding. And so the idea of number is that this is a two, it's a dyad, or duet, sometimes called. And this is a triad, if you will, because it includes bounded infinity and then what we call the mixed. So there's your 2 and 3, but we need a 1. And that's what's going to come up next. They're going to talk about that first cause, that mysterious cause that is so far transcendent that we don't really have a name for it. We don't even though we call it a cause, it's too far transcendent to really talk about that cause and effect relationship. So there's some mystery here as well, right? But we want to better understand it. And so there's our 1, there's our 2, there's our 3, and then we can proliferate down from there. So we want to understand all the realms of reality. And that's what we mean by number here. But let's take a look now. Socrates is going to go on to talk about this first cause. Oh yeah, and by the way, there are 2 names that is given to this cause, even though it is beyond all names. There are 2 names that we use for it. Sometimes the 1, as we saw in the dialogue Parmenides. Sometimes the good, as we saw in the dialogues Symposium and also in the Republic. We tend to use 1 when we're tying it to bound, and also 1 is like that, the oneness that is the essence that is required for all the condition for all of existence, and also on the return, it's that unity within ourselves that we feel pulling us up. We saw that in the Republic as well. But the good is the name we saw mostly in the Republic, and that's used when we're talking about the providential goodness that flows through all the realms of reality, and also the desire, the beauty, the love that pulls us back up on the return. And so those 2 names are used, and we're about to see him using the good, since we're looking for the best life. In what condition is the good? Must it of necessity be perfect, or may it want perfection? Of all things, O Socrates, it is the most perfect. Well, and is it also sufficient? Without doubt, and in this respect it excels all other things. But further, this also, I presume, is of all things the most necessary to say of it, that every being to whom it is known hunts after and desires it, as choosing the possession of it above all things, and indeed caring for no other things except such as are constantly attended with the enjoyment of good. Now then, let us consider and judge the life of pleasure and the life of knowledge. And to do this the better, let us view them each apart from the other. Okay, so now that we've got that metaphysics out of the way, we're going to go back to looking at these 2 lifestyles, the life of pleasure and the life of knowledge. All right, so here's Socrates' idea of how to proceed. Thus, let us suppose a life of pleasure unaccompanied by intelligence, and on the other hand, a life of intelligence unaccompanied by pleasure. For if either of them be good, it must be complete and sufficient, in want of no aid from any other quarter. But if either of them should appear to be indigent of aught, or insufficient, we are no longer to imagine this to be that real and true good that we are in search of. And Protarchus agrees that in such a case, how could we? Okay, so first, the life of pleasure. Having neither intellect nor memory nor science nor opinion in the first place of this very thing, your possession of joy, you must of necessity be ignorant, and unable to say whether you then had any joy or not, being devoid of all just discernment or knowledge of things present. I must. And he goes on. Being also void of memory, it would be impossible for you to remember that you ever had any joy, or to preserve even the least memorial of a joy then present. Wanting also in right opinion, you could not so much as think you had any joy, though in the midst of it. Unable also to reason or draw consequences, you could not possibly conclude that ever you should have any joy to come. Thus you would live the life not of a man, but of a sea sponge or of an oyster. Are these things so, or ought we to think otherwise concerning them? And Protarchus agrees that a life of mere pleasure must be such as you have described it. So now they go on to the life of knowledge. Let us consider whether any of us would choose to live with wisdom and intellect and science and a perfect memory of all things, but without partaking of pleasure, whether great or small, and on the other hand, without partaking of pain, wholly exempt from all feelings of either kind. To me, O Socrates, neither of these lives appears desirable, and I think never would appear so to anyone else either. So he doesn't even need to look at that one. They're done with that life. So now Socrates goes on to a third option. What think you of a middle life, where both of them are mixed together, a life composed of the other two? Composed of pleasure, do you mean, on the one hand, and of intellect and wisdom on the other hand? Just so, such a life do I mean. Oh, everyone would certainly prefer such a kind of life to either of the other two. Okay, so they've decided to give first prize to this mixed life. But now they need to think about second prize. What to do with the second prize and which life to bestow on it is next to be considered. Now on this point I would still more earnestly contend against Philebus that not pleasure but intellect is the nearest allied, and the most similar to that, whatever it be, by the possession of which the mixed life becomes desirable and good. Now, to go into this discussion, Socrates is going to introduce 4 different classes based on the metaphysics that we saw before. God, we said, has exhibited the infinite and also the bound of beings. Very true. So let us take these 2 of the species or classes of things, and for a third, let us take that which is composed of those 2 mixed together. So now we have 3 classes or species. But I deserve, methinks, to be laughed at for pretending thus to distinguish things and to enumerate their several species. In other words, the list is not complete. Why so, my good friend? A 4th kind appears to have been omitted by me. Say what? Of the commixture, the combination of the former 2, consider the cause, and besides those 3 species, set me down this cause for a 4th. Okay, so now we have 4 classes. So there is infinity, and then bound, the mixed, and then the cause of the mixed. Okay, now he's going to just briefly explain what these 4 classes are. Whatever things appear to us to be increasing or diminishing, or to admit of intenseness and remission, or the too much, and all other such attributes, we ought to refer to all these as the genus of the infinite. In other words, anything you would put ER on, or more or less. Collecting, as it were, all of them in one, agreeably to what was before said, that whatever things were divided and separated, we ought to assemble together and combine, as well as we're able, affixing to all of them the mark of some one nature, if you remember. I remember it well. Okay, yeah, so the infinite is like the smaller, the larger, the more handsome, the less handsome, and so on. And now for the bound. Everything then which rejects all such attributes and admits only such as are quite the contrary. In the first place, the equal and equality, and after the equal, the double, and every other relation which one number bears to another, and one measure to another. All these things I say, in summing up and referring them to bound, think you not that we should do right? Or how say you? Perfectly right, O Socrates. So now we have class 1 and 2, and now for class 3, the mixed. We mentioned just now the hotter and the colder, did we not? We did. To these, then, add the drier and the moister, the more numerous and the fewer, the swifter, the slower, the larger, the smaller. So a number of examples of the infinite. Whatever things beside in our late account of them, we ranked under one head, that which admits of the nature of the more and the less. You mean the infinite. I do. And mingled together that which we spoke of next afterward, the race of bound. And in the acute and the grave, in the swift also in the slow, which are of them infinite, does not the other sort received among them in begetting bounds constitute the perfection of all the muses' art? Okay, so in other words, when you put limitation on that which is infinite, that's when you get perfection in art. And he says, certainly so. And in weather excessively either cold or hot, does not the entrance of that other kind take off the excess, the vehement, and the infinite, generating in their stead not only the moderate and the measured, but symmetry also, in correspondence between their measures without dispute. I just want to point out here some terminology that we've actually already been introduced to, but we're seeing it again. Perfection, measurement, and symmetry. These are all going to be tied to the good. We're going to see that much later, though, in the dialogue. That was just a bit of foreshadowing there. And so going on then about the mixed, of those two sorts, bound in infinity then, all the progeny, all the things produced into being through those measures which are effected into the immoderate, when bounds are set to the infinite, in summing up all these things together and comprehending them in one, understand me to mean by the third sort, this one. I understand you, he says. So the mixed is when bounds are set to the infinite. And then the cause of fourth class. That then which is the artificer of all these, the cause of them, let us call the fourth, as it is fully shown to be different from those other three. It wasn't actually fully shown, there isn't much said about it, but he's just stressing here that cause, whatever that is different from the effects. So it's a fourth class. And so in summary, the first then I call infinite, the second is bound, the third is essence, mixed and generated from these. And in saying that the cause of this mixture and this production is the fourth, should I say aught amiss? Certainly not. And so now what he wants to do is take the three lives that we've been looking at here, the life of pleasure, the life of knowledge, and the life mixed of those two, pleasure and knowledge. He's going to take those three and place them in one of the categories. So there are 4 categories, 3 lives, which means one is left out. Let's take a look at how they do it. So first, the mixed life, which I think is probably the easiest one to place. I think we shall agree that it is part of the third sort, the mixed. For the mixed life is not to be referred solely to any one of the infinites, mixed with some one only of the bounds. It is a life of all such things together as are infinite in their own nature, but are under the restraint of bound, so that the mixed life, this winner of the prize, may be rightly said to be a part of the third sort, most rightly. And now the life of pleasure. Concerning pleasure and pain, have they in their own nature any bounds, or are they among those things which admit the more and the less? Pleasure, O Socrates, to be sure, admits the more, for it would not comprehend every good in it if it were not by nature infinite, with respect to the multitude which it contains, and the increase which it is capable of. So remember that Protarchus was making the case, along with Philebus, that the life of pleasure is the best life, and so he's still talking in that way here. And then we go on to the life of knowledge. So we've got 2 categories left. Either knowledge will be placed in the category or in the class of bound, or it'll be placed in the class of cause. So let's see what Socrates does here. He says, there is a consent and harmony among all the wise, dignifying thus themselves, that intellect is king of heaven and earth. One of the most famous lines, by the way, in this whole dialogue. Now, we saw in the Statesman, there was a myth of the age of Cronus, and there we saw that Cronus is the intellect who oversees the intelligible world, and Zeus was the intellect who oversees the physical world. And so here, intellect would be Zeus in mythology. We may better assert, as a consequence of our reasoning, that in the universe there are what we have several times repeated, infinite in great quantity, bound sufficient, and besides these, a cause, not inconsiderable or mean, which by mixing them properly together marshals and regulates the years, the seasons, and the months, a cause which with the greatest justice we may term wisdom and intellect. With the greatest justice indeed. But further, wisdom and intellect could never be without soul, by no means, he says. And so Socrates then gives one of the other very famous lines from this dialogue. You will affirm then that in the nature of Zeus there is a kingly soul and a kingly intellect through the power of cause. Okay, so there's the metaphysics behind that mythology. And he goes on to say that the discourse we have now had together on this subject, O Protarchus, think it not idle and to no purpose, for it supports that doctrine of our ancestors that the universe is forever governed by intellect. Indeed it does. And besides, it has furnished us with an answer to my question, to what genus intellect is to be referred, in making it appear that intellect is allied to that which we said was the cause of our things, one of our four genera. For now at length you plainly have our answer. Okay, so the life of knowledge was put in the class of cause. And if I don't know if you can hear the dog barking outside, but I do apologize for that. It's not my dog, so I can't stop it. Okay, summary then. Concerning these two, the life of pleasure and the life of knowledge, let us remember these conclusions: that intellect is allied to cause and is nearly of this genus, and that pleasure is infinite in her own nature and belongs to that genus which of itself neither has nor ever will have in it either a beginning or a middle or an end. And so that will bring us to the end of today's video. Next week, I'm going to go on with the Philebus to show what Socrates is going to do with everything that he did today. So again, if you like what you saw, I do hope you'll give it a thumbs up, and please think about subscribing and sharing with your friends. As always, feel free to leave a comment below, or if you have any questions for me, you can send me an email. There is an email address in the description box. So thank you very much, and I do hope you'll join me next week.